If you watched the video I posted just a couple days ago of the Rivian R2 charging from 10 to 80%, then you know that Rivian lied to us about the vehicle's charging capability. It actually did better than what they promised. Well, I'm back here at another DC fast charger, this time to record a 0 to 100% charge recording and map out the entire charge curve. Now, the 10 to 80% charge recording that I've already done is actually more important than this one, in my opinion, because that's what most users are going to experience. Most people don't drive their vehicle down to 0 when they're on a road trip. Very few people do. And very few people charge it above 80 or 85% because when you do that, the charging slows down dramatically. You don't want to waste your time at a DC fast charger. When you're at home charging on level 2, you don't care because you're eating, sleeping, doing whatever while the car is topping off at a higher state of charge and charging slower. But when you're at a DC fast charger, you're typically waiting for it to finish. And you don't want to sit around and wait once it gets over 80 or 85% because it takes very long to top off electric vehicles. So what we're going to do here is map out the 0 to 100% charging curve so we have a complete picture of how the Rivian R2 will charge on a DC fast charger that can supply it the power it's requesting. And that's the important thing here, because Rivian gave the R2 the ability to accept over 600 amps. That is unusual with electric vehicles. They did that so it would charge faster on DC fast chargers. Most other auto manufacturers, when they really want to ramp up the charging power, they go from a 400 volt battery system up to an 800 volt battery system. Rivian didn't want to do that with the R2 because their main focus was cost savings. And jumping up to an 800 volt architecture would have significantly increased the cost of the R2. So what they did was gave it the ability to charge it over 600 amps. And that allows the R2 to charge at over 200 kilowatt up to about 30% state of charge. So I'm here today to map out the full 0 to 100% charging curve. The 10 to 80% charging curve I've already done. That's up on State of Charge. I'll drop a link in the description of this video, but I'm here today to map out the full 0 to 100% charging curve. I'm gonna plug it in now, record the whole charging session, plot everything out on my charts and graphs, and then we'll beat this to death with all the analyzing that I always do with my DC fast charge recordings. Let's get into it. All right, so as I mentioned, I've already posted my 10 to 80% R2 charging video. And in that video, the R2 charged from 10 to 80% in slightly less than 27 minutes. Now, Rivian promises a 10 to 80% charge time of 29 minutes. So we beat it by a solid 2 minutes, which is always good to see when the auto manufacturer underpromises and over-delivers. And that was the case I found with the R2 charging on a DC fast charger. But Rivian may have not given its full charging potential because it may be difficult for many R2 owners to actually achieve the 10 to 80% in the time that I did. And that's because of what I alluded to in that first intro. The fact that the R2 can pull slightly over 600 amps, so about 630 amps is what Rivian told me is the maximum that it can pull. Very few DC fast chargers can deliver that much. You have the Alpatronic HYC 400s that the Mercedes-Benz network uses, that Iona famously uses. Iona uses them exclusively across their whole network. Walmart uses them in many of their locations, about half their locations. The other half of their locations, they use the ABB A400s, which is what I had available to me in Colorado Springs. And I chose that station because there were no other chargers that could deliver 600 amps within driving distance for me that day. So I had no choice. I had to go there. And the reason why I had to use an adapter, a CCS1 to NACS adapter, was because on the Walmart network, the CCS1 side can deliver 600 amps. But the NACS side of the charger, and all of their chargers have both one NACS connector and one CCS1 connector. The NACS side can only deliver 375 amps. Now, most electric vehicle owners will not notice the difference. Their car will take slightly longer to charge, but not more than a couple of minutes. And when you're on a road trip, typically people aren't really standing there and studying the data from the charger. They just come back when it's at 70% or 80%, whatever their endpoint was. And if it's a minute or two longer, people rarely even notice this. I still wish Walmart would offer full 600 amps on both sides. I think they will in the future. I think that ABB just wasn't ready with the A400 to have a NACS connector and cable liquid cooled to handle the full 600 amps. I do believe at some point in the future they will, like Iona does, offer 600 amps on both sides. In any event, I had to use adapters while I was doing all my charge testing. And when I did the 10 to 80% charging session, I had a problem with the adapter. I made a separate video about that, explaining for R2 owners to be careful not to use the wrong adapter. I used a Tesla adapter, one of their older adapters, that is not rated to handle 600 amps, and the adapter melted. It didn't derate, which I thought might happen. It didn't send a signal. The charger itself didn't notice the pins were getting too hot. It didn't derate. It just let it charge straight through. So if you're interested in that issue, I have another video. I'll drop a link to that video in the description of this video. In any event, for the full 0 to 100% charging session, I used different adapters. I bought a bag full of adapters because I thought I might have problems. And in this specific charging session, I did have a slight problem. At around 30%, you'll see that in the video, the adapter started getting too warm and derated. Now that's what it's supposed to do. The adapters have thermal sensors in them, the good ones at least, the safety certified ones, the ones that are compliant to UL 2252, and it started derating. And I noticed that. And as soon as I noticed that, I unplugged, got another adapter out of the bag, plugged it back in to continue the charging session. So I'm actually going to piece together 2 charging sessions for this one. Now, I think I did a good job, and I think I will be representing the true charging curve for the Rivian, but we'll get into that once you take a look at the curve on paper. But this is how adapters are supposed to work. If they're getting too hot, if they're drawing too many amps for too long of a period of time, they send a signal to the charger that, hey, why don't you cool things down for a little bit? And it lowers the amperage. And if it gets to a point where it continues to get hot, it shuts off charging. Now, that might not be what you want to hear when you're on a road trip and you need to charge, but for safety reasons, that is how it should work. And that's what happened with me. I was using an Electron adapter, and it was pulling 600 amps like the Rivian R2 can do. And it hit a point where the adapter got too warm, and the car actually had a little message on the screen saying adapter warm, lowering charge rate. As soon as I saw that, I shut off the charging session, pulled out my A to Z CCS1 to NACS adapter, which is also UL 2252 certified, plugged that in, and then that was able to hold for the rest of the charging session, because now we're already at about 30%. So the vehicle isn't going to be calling for as much amperage. It's starting to ramp down its amperage. So it was able to complete the rest of the charging session, even though it was over an hour long and the first adapter overheated in like 6 minutes because the amount of power was going through it, which I'll explain in the video. But I just wanted to point that out now. We're going to watch the time-lapse full recording of the 0 to 100% charging session now, but it does get broken up into 2 charging sessions, which I pieced together so it looks like one, but you'll see exactly when I unplugged and plugged back in with the new adapter and continued the charging session. So with that said, let's get into it and check out the time-lapse recording of the full 0 to 100% Rivian R2 charging session. State of Charge is powered by Qmerit, North America's premier installer of electric vehicle charging equipment. After I've helped you decide which charger to buy, follow the link in the description of my videos and have Qmerit install it. And if you do follow that link, Qmerit will waive the $150 installation deposit. But this is an exclusive offer for State of Charge followers. So in order to get that offer, you must follow the link in the description of my videos. After 1 minute, the R2 is already pulling the full 600 amps that the ABB charger can deliver and is charging at over 210 kilowatts. The charging rate gradually increases as the battery pack's voltage increases along with its state of charge. We reach the highest charging power at the 8-minute mark when the R2 is pulling 225 kilowatts. I saw a maximum of 226 kilowatts in my 10 to 80% recording, but in this session, it peaked at 225 kilowatts because this is the point when the adapter's thermal sensor triggered the DC fast charger to lower the amperage because it was getting too hot. It took me about 2 minutes to notice, and when I did, I immediately shut off charging, unplugged, and swapped the overheating Electron adapter with the A to Z adapter and started charging back up. Note that the R2 has been charging for 10 minutes and has already taken in 31.8 kilowatt hour. We're going to need to add that to the second charging session to get the final totals. Once charging resumed, the R2 climbed up to 222 kilowatts, almost exactly where it was when the adapter overheated and derated the charging power. So the R2 should be back to following its normal charging curve. The R2 reached 50% state of charge in about 15 and a half minutes. For all the hate the R2 has gotten online as far as its charging ability, this really isn't bad. If I didn't have the 2-minute derating earlier on, I bet it would have reached 50% in just under 15 minutes. Now 50% of the R2's battery is going to be good for about 120 to 130 miles of driving at highway speeds. Continuing on, the R2 continues to gradually lower its charging rate and reaches 70% state of charge after 24 minutes of charging. I'm stopping it here at 70% because Rivian, along with most OEMs, offers the 10% to 80% charging time to its customers. And according to Rivian, the R2 can charge from 10 to 80% in 29 minutes. In my 10 to 80% recording, the R2 did it in just under 27 minutes. 10 to 80% is 70% of the battery, and here we added 70% of the battery in 24 minutes, and that includes the temporary derating, which probably cost us about a minute. It's my guess that with a clean charging session, the R2 can reach 70% state of charge from a completely drained battery in about 23 minutes. The R2 then reaches 80% in under 31 minutes. Remember, Rivian quoted the 10 to 80% time in 29 minutes, but the R2 can actually charge from 0 to 80% in about 29 minutes if you factor in the minute I lost with the adapter derating. It takes 11 more minutes to go from 80% to 90%, which is only about 2 miles of range added per minute of charging, and definitely not worth waiting at a DC fast charger for. And now I'm going to speed up the recording here because above 90%, the R2 charges painfully slow. It takes another 11 minutes to reach 95% state of charge, and does so after 52 minutes of charging. But then it takes 46 more minutes to charge that final 5% and shut off, as the R2 really slows down charging at the top end to gradually balance out all of its battery cells. This should be enough evidence for any R2 owner watching to never stay at a DC fast charger past 90% unless it's absolutely necessary to make it to your destination. Okay, so the final numbers are an hour and 38 minutes for the complete 0 to 100% charging. That's probably about a minute longer than it would have taken if I didn't have that thermal derating issue with the adapter. And if I had the 31.8 kilowatt hour that we used in the first charger recording to the 64.7 kilowatt hour here, the total added energy is 96.5 kilowatt hour. And that sits perfectly with what I'd expect. The R2 has about 88 kilowatt hours of usable energy in its battery. And I drained the battery down to just about empty before plugging in here. So with the expected 10% charging losses, 96.5 is just about what I'd expect. All right, well, the R2 really isn't that bad of a DC fast charging electric vehicle. Now, we know that it's not class leading, and there's been a lot of talk and criticism online about Rivian not opting to go to an 800 volt battery architecture. They stuck with the 400 volt architecture. The 800 volt architecture does allow for higher charging speeds, faster charging. But with the R2, Rivian's primary objective was keeping the cost down. This had to be the affordable Rivian, the mass market vehicle that sells a lot, and it would have added a couple $1,000s to the price of the vehicle if they opted to upgrade and go with an 800 volt architecture. And the decision was to stick with 400 volt and keep the price as low as possible. I think they made the right decision. It's not a bad charging electric vehicle. I think it's going to be fine for road trips. Where it does get really bad is at the higher states of charge. Once you get above 80%, it's really not a good DC fast charging vehicle at all. The charging rates are super low. Once you get over 90%, forget it. It falls off the charts. It's a terrible charging electric vehicle. I think it was 46 minutes to go from 95% to 100%. And I think it takes 52 minutes to go from 0 to 95%. So you look at those numbers, it's crazy. It almost takes as long to charge from 95% to 100% that it does from 0 up to 95%. So yeah, you don't want to be at a DC fast charger with an R2 or with most electric vehicles, really above 90%. Most people say best practices is unplug at 80%. Really depends. I recommend even unplugging at a lower state of charge. If you don't need that extra battery to get to your destination, only stay as long as you need. Of course, give yourself a little buffer, maybe a 10% battery buffer, but you know, don't hang out at DC fast chargers longer than you have to. It costs more than charging at home usually, and it's a waste of time. So with the R2, you know, you can get to a relatively high state of charge in you know, a half an hour. You're going to add 70+% of the battery in 30 minutes. So it's really not that bad a charging vehicle. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at the charging curves on paper. Now remember, I have to piece together 2 charging sessions, but the R2 made it real easy for me because when I plugged back in, it quickly went back up just about to where it left off. So as you'll see on the chart, I'm going to connect the 2 lines and do, say, a hypothetical charging curve. But the good news is when I overlay my 10 to 80% charging curve on top of this one that I connect the dots, it's almost perfect. So I do believe that this would be the charging curve if I didn't have that thermal derating for a couple of minutes. But we'll go over that now with the charging power and charging curve chart. So this is my charging power chart. You have the charging power in kilowatts on the y-axis and the state of charge on the x-axis. The red line indicates the first part of this session from 0% state of charge to 34% state of charge when I unplugged. And the black line shows the second part of the session when the R2 charged from 34% all the way up to 100%. For the purpose of showing the full charging curve, I'm going to simulate a single session simply by connecting the graph where the thermal derating occurred with the maximum charging power of the second part of the session after the R2 initially ramped up its charging rate. Here you can see the potential lost kilowatt hour during that 2-minute derating period and the 1-minute ramping up period of the second charging session. I'm still not sure if the actual charging curve looks something like this because it is possible that starting a new session allowed the R2 to jump up to a higher charging rate for that first minute and a half or so. But even if that is the case, and this area here shouldn't be included, this amount of extra power wouldn't even add up to 15 or 20 seconds of time savings, so it's really not worth worrying about in my opinion. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to stick with this simulated charging curve, and I'm pretty confident it's very close to what would have been the results if there was no derating and this was a single charging session. This is how it looks when I removed the 2 extra lines. And this is how it would look if the R2 tapered off during that derating period instead of holding full power to 36% state of charge. I'm leaning to thinking this is probably how it actually looks. But until I have the opportunity to charge R2s multiple times, I'm going to stick with the results of these 2 charging sessions connected at each's peak charging rate. Okay, so here's the simulated 0 to 100% R2 charging curve. I'm calling this a simulation because I just connected the line for that 5% of the charging curve from 29% to 34%. And we don't know yet for certain if that affected the second charging session. But in a minute, I'm going to show you an overlay of the 10% to 80% session I did, and that kind of clears things up a bit. So the R2 holds close to full power up to 36%. This is the only part of the curve that I'm not 100% certain of. The R2 may lower its charging rate at around 31%, but that will have less than a minute difference in the charging time, so it's practically irrelevant, except for the picture of it. After 36% state of charge, the charging rate decline is nearly linear and drops below 150 kilowatts after 50% state of charge, and then holds 100 kilowatts until 73% state of charge. The one exception to the linear decline is this little bump at 67% to 73% state of charge. That temporary bump in charging power is actually part of the R2's programmed charging curve. It's not an anomaly. I've seen charging recordings for the R2 from more than a dozen different charging sessions on different vehicles, and on every one it looks exactly like this. Now let's take a look at my 10 to 80% charging session overlaid. Look at how similar it is. They're almost perfectly overlaid except for the part that I estimated because I needed to connect the 2 charging sessions. Even the bump that I just spoke about at 67% is exactly the same in both sessions. I'm confident these are accurate depictions of the R2's charging curve. The only area for debate is this little section shown in blue. The rest of the charging curve is definitely accurate. All right, well, that's not that bad. Again, not great, but it's really not that bad. I don't think it deserves the criticism that a lot of people have given the R2 online as far as charging speed. If you take a look at it, I went from 0 to 80% in about 30 minutes, but as I mentioned earlier, I think I lost about a minute with that switchover when I had the adapter derate. So I fully believe the R2, when charging on a charger that can deliver 600 amps, and there's not a ton of them out there, can charge from a flat battery, 0% state of charge, to 80% in 29 minutes. And if you break out the 10 to 80% of this charging session, it did it in just about the same time that I did the 10 to 80% charge recording that I posted last week. It was just a touch under 27 minutes. So yeah, the R2 can absolutely charge from 10 to 80 in 27-ish minutes if you're on a charger that can deliver that power. Now, if you're on a 350 kilowatt charger that has 500 amp limitation, it's going to be a minute or two longer. I don't think much longer than that because you're only going to lose that time really at the beginning of the charging curve, like up to about 30, 32%. After that, the R2 is no longer pulling more than 500 amps. So you're only going to lose it really right up at the beginning. And if you were to plug in at 30%, let's say that's just when you need to stop, it won't make a difference if you're on a charger that can deliver 500 amps or one that can deliver 600 amps. So in any event, so that's the charging curve. Not bad. Of course, when we get up over 70, 80%, slows down a lot. Most EVs do that. You can see just how slow it gets. But actually the next charts that I'm going to show you now, the time to charge charts, these show it even more clearly, where you can really see how many miles per minute you're adding throughout the whole charging session, and also how long it takes the R2 to add range. And we'll use both the EPA range rating and also the results of my 70 mile an hour highway range test that I did with the R2. Now, I do need to note that that range test I did was with an R2 with the 20-inch all-terrain wheels and tires. So the 21-inch road tires with the all-season the all-season tires and the road wheels should perform a little bit better. I know the EPA range rating is higher. However, my friend Kyle Connor from over at Out of Spec just did a range test with it, and it didn't do better than what I did with the 20-inch all-terrain tires and wheels. So I'm a little surprised by that. I had expected it to do a little bit better than what I did. He basically got the same. I think he got like 5 miles less than what I did even. So the R2 doesn't appear to be a great long-range EV driving at highway speeds. I think we need a little bit more data out there, but from the early range tests that I did and Kyle did, it looks like driving at 70 miles an hour, using the whole pack, 0 to 100%, you're only going to get about 250 to 260 miles, much less than even the EPA highway range rating on the R2, which was 301 miles if you had the 20-inch all-terrain wheels and tires. I'm not sure what the highway range rating was with the 21-inch road tires with the wheels with the all-season tires, but it would be higher than that. It's probably like 310 or something like that. So it's going to go substantially less than the EPA range rating. But again, I think that's overblown for a lot of people. I think for most people, having 230 to 250 miles of highway driving range is enough. I know it's enough for me. That's a solid 3 hours of driving before I need to stop somewhere and plug in. And honestly, on a long drive, 3 hours is about the right time that I want to stop and maybe use a restroom, just refresh, stretch my legs, get a cup of coffee, and then head back out. And if you time it right with the R2 and you plug in at a low state of charge, under 20%, 10-ish% or so, you're going to get up to 70, 80% in 20, 25 minutes, which isn't much longer than it takes you to just get a quick break and get back out on the road. All right, so now we're going to look at the time to charge charts and see how long it takes to add range and how many miles per minute are added to the R2 while charging. Today's video is sponsored by evchargingstations.com. If you drive an electric vehicle or you're planning to, this site is packed with comprehensive charger reviews, detailed DC fast charging graphs, and the latest news from all of the fast charging networks. You'll find real-world testing, easy to understand comparison, and deep dives into how different electric vehicles actually charge. Before you buy an EV charger or plan your next road trip, make sure to bookmark evchargingstations.com and make smarter charging decisions. Okay, so let's take a look at my time to charge chart. Now, this chart has the charging time in minutes on the x-axis and the state of charge on the y-axis. You'd notice that I added some miles per minute dotted lines. 5 miles per minute, 10 miles per minute, 15 miles per minute. You really want to get up over 10 miles per minute to have good charging times. And as you can see here, the R2 for the first 20 minutes of charging stays north of that 10 miles per minute line. Now I have to note, this chart is based on the R2 performance all-wheel drive with the 20-inch all-terrain tires and wheels, the EPA range rating of that vehicle. We'll get into my range test in a minute. But as you can see here, for the first 20 minutes and up till about the 63, 64% state of charge, the R2 is actually taking in more than 10 miles per minute. What you want on this chart is a very sharp vertical climb, and we get that for the first 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, it becomes more horizontal. That's when the vehicle is charging slower. And really quickly, I'm going to overlay the charging curve with the time to charge chart. Now here, the charging time in minutes is still on the x-axis, but on the left, you have the charging power in kilowatts on the y-axis, and on the right, you have state of charge on the y-axis. Now this chart here looks a little different than the charging curve that you just saw because we're introducing time, and that compresses the charging curve a little bit. Up front, you can see just how much extra power gets added those first 20 minutes. As the charging rate slows up, the charging power lowers and the charging slows down. Now, I'm not going to really talk too much about this. I just wanted to post this for those that are interested in taking a screenshot and saving it. Okay, back to the time to charge chart here, but now you see all the figures added. Look up in the upper left-hand corner. We see that it says range replenishment. This is based on the EPA combined range rating of 307 miles for the R2 Performance dual motor with the 20-inch all-terrain tires. The average charging speed for this entire charging session is 3.1 miles per minute, which is terrible, but that's normal when you look at the entire charging session. It charges so slowly up at the top, as so many electric vehicles does, that it ruins that miles per minute average for the whole charging session. It's a pretty much useless metric, but I put it up there anyway. What you really want to look at is in the green. From 10 to 80%, the R2 averaged 8 miles per minute. It added 215 miles of EPA rated range in 26.8 minutes. Again, not world class, but really not that bad. And then let's take a look at up at the top. From 80% to 90%, it averaged only 2.7 miles per minute. You added only 31 miles and you sat there for 11 minutes. It gets even worse after 90%, but I just like to point out some of the highlights there. So now let's look at the blue chart over here in the lower right, and we'll take a look at this in minutes. 10-minute blocks of minutes. The first 10 minutes of charging, the R2 added 11 miles for every minute of charging if you want to use the EPA range rating as the metric. It added 9.5 miles if you want to use the results of my highway range test. The second 10 minutes of charging, 8.5 miles per minute EPA, 7.3 miles per minute with my range test. Now here's where it starts to slow up a lot. From 20 minutes to 30 minutes, only 5.1 miles of range added for every minute of charging with the EPA cycle, and 4.4 minutes with my range test. Now, from the half hour point, we dropped down to 2.8 miles of range added per minute and 2.4. 40 to 50 minutes, it's 1.6 and 1.4. 50 to 60 minutes, not even a mile per minute, 0.9 and 0.8. And then from the 60 to 70 minute point, half a mile per minute of charging and 0.4 miles per minute of charging, according to my range test. This chart really helps people to visualize how much range they're adding for every minute they're charging. And you can really look at it and say, okay, after 20 to 30 minutes, it's just not worth staying there unless you absolutely need to get to your destination. Quite honestly, if I was in a rush getting somewhere, I would never charge the R2 more than 20 minutes at a DC fast charger. At one, at least I can deliver the full 600 amps. If you had a charger that charged a little bit slower, you'd be able to stay maybe till the 30-minute point. But if you were on like an Alpatronic HYC 400 that can deliver 600 amps, 20 minutes is the most that I would stay if I was in a rush to get somewhere. I'd unplug and move on. You'd get to your destination faster, making that second stop and charging again. Okay, now we'll take the same time to charge chart, and instead of focusing on miles per minute, we're going to focus on driving range. And again, we're going to use the EPA range rating and also the results of my 70 mile an hour highway range test. It takes 4.5 minutes to add 50 miles of driving range EPA cycle, and 5.2 minutes if you're going to use my 70 mile an hour highway range test that ended up with the R2 going 264 miles. You can add 100 miles of driving range in 8.8 minutes for the EPA cycle and 10.5 minutes according to my real world highway range test. 150 miles comes in 14 minutes EPA, 17.1 minutes with my range test. 200 miles in 20.7 minutes EPA, 26.4 minutes with my range test. 250 miles, 30.9 minutes EPA, 49.9 minutes according to my range test. And 300 miles of EPA rated range comes in just over an hour, 60.6 minutes. It never arrives with my 70 mile an hour highway range test because I only went 264 miles. I'm convinced after the range test that I did that the R2, with whatever tires you want to put on it, won't go 300 miles if you're driving at highway speeds. And last but not least, my master charging chart for the R2. Now, there's a lot of data on here, and I'm obviously not going to go through all of it, but let me explain what's in every box. Each box represents 10% state of charge during this charging session. And you can start at any starting point, that's 10% interval, and end at any 10%. For instance, you could look at all the data from 20% state of charge to 70% state of charge, or from 40% to 90%, whatever you want. And in every box, you get how long it took to charge that section in minutes, how much state of charge was added in that section, the added range according to the EPA range rating, the average charging power in kilowatt. That's a very important metric. And also how much energy was added in kilowatt hour. So let's just take a look at one box. We're going to go from 0 to 50%. That's the box right here. Took 14 minutes to charge from 0 up to 50%. That's pretty good. The R2 averaged 200 kilowatts of charging power. We added 50% of the battery because 0 to 50% is 50% of the battery. That translates to 154 miles EPA. And we added 44 kilowatt hour because the R2 has a usable battery capacity of 88 kilowatt hour. Now you also notice that all these boxes are different colors. Down on the lower left-hand chart of the legend, you can see what that means. The light green boxes are when the R2 is charging at its fastest rate. When the average charging power during that section was greater than 80% of the peak charging power. And then the second box down is the darker green. That's when the average charging power was somewhere between 60% and 79%. Then the beige boxes are 40% to 60%, the orange boxes from 20% to 39%, and the red boxes are when the R2 is charging extremely slowly at less than 20% the peak charging power. You really want to avoid the red boxes at all costs. Quite honestly, you want to avoid the orange boxes and the beige boxes also. You really want to stick with the green boxes. The light green is charging fastest and the dark green isn't bad, but to be quite honest with you, when I'm in a rush trying to get somewhere, I look at the master charging chart for the EV that I'm driving and I stick with the light green boxes because that's when I'm getting the most miles per minute, the biggest bang for buck. And unless I absolutely need more range, that's all I'll charge on a DC fast charger. I won't stick around and get into any of the other colors. It's just the light green for me when I'm on a road trip. All right, so after many months of online debates on whether or not Rivian made the right decision with sticking with a 400 volt architecture versus jumping it up to an 800 volt architecture, perhaps charging an extra $1,500 for the vehicle. I'm just throwing a number out there. It would be a significant increase in cost of more than $1,000, maybe as much as $2,000. I'm not sure, but it would cost more and it would make the vehicle cost more. Did they make the right decision with the 400 volt architecture? I'm in the camp that they did, especially now that after I've had the opportunity to charge the R2 multiple times and get some really clean recordings out of it, I believe that it's not a bad charging electric vehicle. Of course, it's not top of class. There are EVs in its category, in its class that charge better. Some of the new EVs coming out that do cost more than R2, but they're in that same type of segment. Volvo EX60, BMW iX3, both of which will charge a lot faster than the R2. They cost a lot more though. So, are they really in that same class? They're in the same category of vehicle, but they're probably not that much of a direct competitor because there's a big difference in price between these vehicles. In any event, after really analyzing the data, I'm looking at it and saying, Rivian absolutely made the right choice. This is a fine vehicle charging wise. Again, not top of class, but it charges fast enough, for me at least, to take it anywhere. And I have an order for an R2. I should be getting it within a couple months. I already got my email saying that we're going to be sending you an email within 2 weeks or so to configure your vehicle. So I should have my R2 in a couple of months. We'll do a lot of content on charging and range and road trips and so forth. But I'm pretty comfortable now knowing that I could take this anywhere. It'll be a fine road tripping vehicle. The range is a little disappointing. The results of my range test was 264 miles. My buddy Kyle just did a range test over out of spec. He got a little bit less. It was like 255, I think. So we're right in that 250 to 260 mile range. And that's in good conditions. In winter conditions, when it's colder, in more challenging terrain, you might see 210, 220. That's the full 0 to 100, which we don't do in the real world. So, in dead of winter, you might only get 200 miles really usable on the highway with the R2. When the weather's better, it's going to be up closer to 230, 240. Again, you're not doing the 0 to 100% when you're on a long road trip like we did with our range tests. So that's something you need to consider. But charging wise, it's fine. If you're going to drive it down to 10% or so, a 20-minute stop is all you need. I don't think you should stop for longer than 20 minutes on an R2 unless you absolutely need that extra range to get to your destination, because that's the sweet spot. That first 20 minutes of charging, where you're getting close to 10 miles a minute, EPA, it's less depending on how fast you're. If you're driving 80 miles an hour, it might be 7 miles a minute that you're getting, something like that, because faster you go, the less efficient the vehicle is going to be. But I'm comfortable with it. I'm actually pleased with the charging, more so than I thought I would be when it first was announced that they were sticking with a 400-volt architecture. And this is use case specific. If you're somebody that's thinking about getting an R2, you do a lot of long distance traveling, you might have cause for concern. The range isn't exactly what you might have expected it would be at highway speeds. The charging maybe isn't as fast as some of the other 800-volt architecture vehicles. But I think most people, it's not going to be a problem for most potential R2 owners at all. I think the charging and even the range is going to be fine. But again, it depends on what you're going to be using it for. My barometer is always, my in-laws live a little more than 200 miles away up in Vermont. I want to make it to their house under pretty much any conditions. The R2 might be a little pushing it in the dead of winter when it's 5-10 degrees out and I'm driving 75, 80 miles an hour up the New York Thruway. It might get a little dicey. I might need to stop. But there's new chargers at all the Apple Green rest stops all along the Thruway, so it makes it really easy. Years ago, there were no chargers, and I had to make it there. It's not as important anymore. My R1H, which I just sold, I had a 2023 R1S, just sold it this week to make room for the R2 here. That made it under any condition, even in the dead of winter. That made it, and while the EPA range rating is similar to the R2, the real world range on the R1S was definitely more than what the R2 is going to be. It's interesting how that works. We need to come up with a better range rating. The EPA does, because it's really not realistic, and you really can't go by that number. I know the EPA, working with the automakers, could come up with something better, and maybe even have two numbers, like a 70 or 80 mile an hour number and a in-town low-speed number. I know they have that EPA now. They have 3 numbers they put out. They actually only put out the combined number anymore. They used to give you the combined, the highway EPA range rating, and the city. They hide the highway in the city now. You only get the combined. If you dig in the EPA documents, you can get it, but they don't really publish it. They just publish the combined. We need an overhaul of that, in my opinion, so we can get more realistic range figures. All right, well, that's all I have here today for the R2 0 to 100% charge session. I want to know what you guys think about it in the comment section. Let's get a little discussion going on. Is this fast enough? Is it good enough? Is the charging that the R2 does combined with its range enough to satisfy you, or maybe keep your R2 reservation? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer questions and comments that you guys have. And if this is your first time here at State of Charge, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming electric vehicle news and reviews. And as always, thanks for watching.